Welcome to London for all my international colleagues. I'd like to welcome you to the 244th CG seminar, which addresses the question, do merger policies increase universities' efficiency? And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Professor Claire Callender from UCL and from Birkbeck University of London. And I'm Deputy Director at CG, at the Centre for Global Higher Education, which is a major research centre funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So today we're hearing from Aleksei Egorov, and he's going to address the question of, do mergers increase, merger policies increase universities' efficiency? Aleksei is a research fellow and PhD candidate at the National Research University Higher School of Economics based in Moscow. His research interests mainly include universities' efficiency and performance measurements, quantitative assessments of policies and interventions in the higher education sector, universities' funding models, and higher education's contribution to economic development. Now, before I hand over to Aleksei, there are a few brief housekeeping points I'd like to mention. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and the recorded version will be posted online on the CG website in due course, and a transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. This gives people an opportunity who couldn't attend today to catch up and watch it online later, virtually. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video turned on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. Now, we recommend that you use the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. If you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat function. At the end of the presentation, I will select which questions will be asked of Aleksei. And if your question is chosen, then I'll let you know, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself and switch on your video and to state your name and where you're from. And now I'm going to pass over to Aleksei. Thank you.
Okay, I will just try to share my screen. So I hope everything is okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and to have an opportunity to present and to discuss topic which I really like. This is a topic which is related to the university mergers in Russia. And today's seminar, I would say, is a kind of the second part of the seminar that we had last week, because last week my colleague Ksenia Romanenko also made a presentation about mergers in Russian higher education sector. And today we are also going to talk about mergers, but I'm going to discuss this topic from a little bit different perspective. The presentation that Ksenia made last week was related to their culture clash and identity loss during the merger process. And today I'm going to discuss the problem of university mergers from the economic point of view. So in particular, I'm going to discuss is whether mergers lead to greater economic efficiency, whether universities become more productive after the mergers. So the question that I'm going to discuss today lies somewhere in the area of higher education policy, because merger policy is a rather popular tool that was used in many national higher education systems. And we will try to answer the question whether merger policies can lead to the outcomes that are usually expected from these policies by the policymakers and by the wider society. The study that I'm going to present today is co-authored by two of my colleagues. First of all, this is Tommaso Agassisti from the Politecnico di Milano School of Management, and this is Margarita Maximova from the Higher School of Economics. Unfortunately, my colleagues are not able to join me today, so I will present the whole study. And here is just a brief outline of what I'm going to discuss today. So firstly, I would like to discuss the policies of university mergers that happened in Russian higher education sector during last decades. Then I will provide some details of particular policy that we are going to evaluate in this study. And then I will proceed to some brief literature review, to the description of methodology that we used in the study, and to the discussion of the results, and to some policy implications that can be derived based on the results of our analysis. Now I think those of you who attended seminar last week saw a similar slide. It is based on one of the studies by Ksenia Romanenko, but I think it's important to make a small reminder for those who did not participate in the previous seminar, because I think this part is rather important for understanding the context of Russian higher education system and the context of merger policies in Russian higher education system. So Russian higher education system, as many other national higher education systems, experienced several merger policies during last decades. So the active merger policy began in Russian higher education just after the collapse of Soviet Union, and still remains rather popular higher education system management tool. And now we can distinguish 4 different waves of mergers that were rather different in terms of principles and in terms of the motivations that determine these merger policies. So the first wave of merger took place in 1991-2000 due to the transition from the planned economy to the market economy. During that period, universities had to adapt to new economic conditions, to new economic environment. The problem was that most Soviet higher education institutions were highly specialized. And these institutions prepared workforce for particular industries. And the distribution of students across different disciplines, across different fields of study, was determined by the needs of the planned economy. And the liberalization in higher education that occurred just after the collapse of Soviet Union was followed by a sharp decrease in the amount of public funds that was available for higher education institutions. And in order to respond to the demand of students, to the changing demand of students, and to survive, universities started merging with each other in order to overcome high level of specialization and meet the new demand from students and their families. The second wave of mergers took place in 2006 and 2014, when the Ministry of Education and Science launched a special program aimed at creating so-called federal universities. The aim of this program was to modernize higher education sector and establish new innovative universities. And it was decided that these universities should be created by merging several universities located in one region. And in total, now we have 10 federal universities located in different regions. The third wave of merger that took place in 2014-2015 was related to the so-called flagship university program. This program, introduced by the Ministry of Education, was aimed at establishing competitive universities in Russian regions, except Moscow and except St. Petersburg, in order to slow down the concentration, the outflow of school graduates to regions with high concentration of universities that provide high quality higher education, which are predominantly, of course, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in total, in 2016, 22 universities were recognized to the winners and merged into 11 flagship universities. In 2017, we had another wave of flagship university program but the requirement about merger between participating universities was eliminated. The fourth wave of mergers was associated with the introduction of so-called annual monitoring of performance of higher education institutions. And in this paper, we focus on this particular type of mergers. And a bit later, I will provide some motivation why we decided to choose this particular wave of mergers. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the merger policies that was based on this monitoring of performance, which we consider in this study. These mergers involved universities with low level of performance, low performing universities. And these low performing universities were merged to stronger universities, to universities with higher level of performance. This was a kind of idea of the policy. And the first question that arises here is, of course, how we can find, how can we identify universities with weak performance. In order to identify these weak universities, in 2012, Ministry of Education launched a special management tool that is called monitoring of performance. Ministry just gathered data on different performance indicators from the universities. There were more than 100 different indicators, and then 7 indicators were used as a principal performance indicators. And for these 7 indicators, ministry sets their threshold values. And if some particular university overcome the thresholds for more than 4 principal indicators, then everything is okay. This university can continue its activities. Otherwise, universities obtained inefficient status. So this universities was recognized as inefficient, as universities with low performance by the ministry. And subsequently, inefficient universities have high probability of being merged with other higher education institutions. And in total, we have 13 universities that were merged within the framework of this policy. And on this slide, you can see a kind of the illustration of the mechanism of this policy. As I've mentioned, we have 7 principal performance indicators. You can see these indicators on the left-hand side of the slide. These are rather standard indicators that reflect quality of entering students, volume of applied research, share of international students, employability of graduates, and so on. And the criteria was for which amount of criteria, for which number of criteria university can achieve the threshold values. Because for each indicator, ministry set a threshold value. And if particular university achieve thresholds for more than 4 indicators, then everything is okay. And if university fails to achieve thresholds for at least 4 performance indicators, then this university is recognized as a low performing university. And we decided to use this particular type of mergers for 2 reasons, actually for 3 reasons, I would say. Firstly, the mergers in these 4 waves were very different. The differences were in the universities involved in the merger process, in principle of the mergers, and so on. And if we consider mergers that were based on the monitoring of performance, we deal with rather homogeneous group of institutions, because all these universities are characterized by rather low level of performance. And secondly, the mechanism of this policy was rather formalized. So we have a clear idea of how universities were selected for mergers. Then this fact is important for our methodology that we use in this study, and I will comment on this a bit later. And the third reason that motivated us to use this particular type of merger for our analysis is that we have rather good data, because monitoring of performance is not only the management tool for higher education sector, it's also a kind of the database that contains a lot of different indicators that reflect performance indicators of Russian universities. And now I proceed to the existing academic discussion of merger policies in higher education. Actually, mergers is a rather popular topic in higher education research. And I would split all studies here into 4 categories. These are studies devoted to the motivations for merger activities, different effects and consequences of mergers, both for individual universities and for higher education system at large. These are studies that are devoted to factors that affect success or failure of the merger process. And finally, and this is, I would say, the most numerous category of studies, and this category is represented by different case studies that analyze merger policies in different national contexts in different countries. And in the context of our study, important part of the literature is represented by studies that are devoted to the motivations for merger activities. Existing literature usually highlight two types of reasons that can motivate mergers between higher education institutions. So firstly, there is an evidence that the first type of motivations are strategic ones, because existing literature suggests that relatively large universities tend to be more competitive on the national and on the global market for higher education, and consequently achieve better positions in international rankings. Secondly, mergers may be motivated by strategic considerations. These are mergers that are related to the objectives of public policy in higher education. And in this case, mergers are implemented in order to achieve financial and maybe management optimization in the whole higher education system. And thirdly, universities of smaller size may want to merge with other organizations just in order to survive and in order to increase growth capabilities. And this is actually the case for the first wave of mergers in Russia just after the collapse of Soviet Union, when higher education institutions were very specialized. The second motivation, the second type of the motivation for merger activities between universities is formed by purely economic considerations, because efficiency theory predicts that in conditions of increasing returns to scale, universities can be run more efficiently together rather than separately, because, for example, the spread of administrative costs over the larger output, because maybe lower costs in some activities and so on. And actually in this study, we tried to check this theoretical assumption that larger universities can be ran more efficiently, and consequently merger should lead to some efficiency gains. And since in this study, we concentrate on economically motivated university mergers, another important stream of literature that we have to address here are represented by papers that studies how mergers influence efficiency of universities. And actually there is a lack of literature here. There are just several papers on Chinese higher education sector and English higher education sector, and mostly authors of the papers that are mentioned here find positive effect of merger on efficiency level. However, several studies highlight that this effect can be observed only in the short run, and in the longer period, efficiency level after the merger, efficiency level turns back to its initial level. And now I'm switching to the research question that we are going to address in this study. So our research question is whether university mergers affect somehow the efficiency of universities that are involved in this merger process. And here I need to make a small note about our definition of efficiency. So when I'm talking about efficiency, I use economic notion of this term. So this is just a performance that is achieved by the organization relative to the amount of resources used by the organization in order to achieve this level of performance. So efficient university is a university that achieves the best possible performance, taking into account amount of resources that are available to this organization. And we define three possible channels through which merger can potentially influence efficiency of university involved in this process. So firstly, this is the economies of scale effect. We assume that larger university can spread administrative costs over the larger output, spread faculty over the larger number of students, spread fixed assets maintenance cost over the larger output, and so on. The second possible channel is economies of scope effect, and the examples of this effect occur when we, for example, merge universities with different missions, because it might be the case that joint production of teaching and research can be more efficient than separate production of these two outputs. Or, for example, if we merge universities with different disciplinary profiles, we can expect the development of some interdisciplinary research and increase of scientific productivity. And finally, and this is, I suppose, the most important factor, this is the quality of management, because we may assume that after the merger, new organizations start to implement new managerial practices of higher quality. And of course, the managerial practices that are adopted in the organization can be considered as an important determinant of its efficiency level. And now I'm switching to our methodology and results. And here you can see the characteristics of our initial sample. So initially we have analyzed 447 universities, which are actually almost all public universities without branches in Russia. And among these 447 universities, we have 38 universities that were recognized as inefficient organizations, and subsequently 14 universities were merged to the other stronger universities. The problem with this analysis is that Russian higher education sector is a very heterogeneous one. So at the first step of our analysis, we decided to homogenize a little bit our sample. And for this purpose, we have implemented propensity score matching technique. And the idea of this methodology is as follows. So we have these 38 universities with inefficient status, and we want to form a control group that includes universities comparable to those that received this inefficient status. When I say comparable, I mean comparable in terms of these 7 performance indicators that are used by the Ministry of Education for decision making. So these universities from the control group were pretty close to this inefficient status, but didn't receive it. And after conducting this algorithm, we obtained sample that consists of 152 universities. So for each university in the treatment group, we select 3 comparable universities in the control group. And this is just a numerical illustration of why we need to implement propensity score matching. Here you can see mean values for performance indicators used by the ministry, and we can see pretty significant differences between 2 groups of universities. And here you can see how the situation looks like after conducting propensity score matching procedure. We can observe that most differences were eliminated, and now we are dealing with rather homogeneous group of universities. After forming a final sample for our analysis, we estimate efficiency of universities in the sample. As I've mentioned already, we define efficiency as a ratio of achieved performance to the resources spent in order to achieve this performance. And we always can just calculate this ratio by dividing performance to the amount of available resources. But situation becomes a little bit more complicated when we are dealing with several resources consumed and several outputs produced. And this is actually the case for universities, because these are complex organizations that use multiple resources in order to produce a lot of different outputs. And in order to measure efficiency in such circumstances, we employ data envelopment analysis. The idea of this methodology is that we have to construct empirical producer possibility frontier, and then we measure the distance from each university to this frontier. So in other words, we compare each university to the best practice, and the best practice is empirical one. So this is what we observe in our sample, actually. And here you can see the specification of our efficiency model. So in the input side, we use the financial resources available to the university, number of academic staff, and average entrance exam score, which is a proxy for the quality of students. And the outputs are publications in scientific journals. This is the amount of applied research, and this is number of employed graduates, which is the measure for the teaching mission of the university. And here you can see just some descriptive statistics for the variables that we use. I think I will skip it. And here you can see the results of our estimations. So we measured efficiency for 2 years, for 2013, when universities received this inefficient status, and for 2017, when all mergers were completed. And we can see that between this period, Russian universities on average experienced efficiency decline. However, the decline of efficiency among merged universities was much smaller. So we can at least descriptively say that merged universities are on average more efficient. And the next step of our analysis is to prove the causal nature of this effect. So we need to prove that this difference in efficiency that we observe here can be associated with this merger policy that we are discussing. And in order to prove the causal nature of this effect, we employ quasi-experimental methodology, which is the regression discontinuity design. And here you can see the specification of the model. The dependent variable in this regression equation is the efficiency gain between 2013 and 2017. And the main explanatory variable is a performance score. So this is our assignment variable, meaning that the Ministry of Education made decisions about mergers based on this variable. And for this assignment variable, we have a threshold. So if university's performance score is higher than the threshold, then university is not treated. If not, then university is assigned to the treatment. So it is prescribed to the merger. And this is just an illustration of how regression discontinuity works. We have an outcome, we have an assignment variable, and we have a threshold point here. And if we have a gap at this threshold point, we can say that there is a statistically significant difference between treatment and control group associated with the policy that we are studying. Next, we have identified the threshold point. I think that I will skip some technical details here, but if there will be some questions about this, I have some additional slides, but now I will skip it. And also, despite the first step, we have implemented this propensity score matching technique in order to homogenize our sample. We decided to control for heterogeneity in the sample even further. For this purpose, we have added in our model 3 additional control variables. These are quality of entrance measured by the average entrance exam score. This is the size of the university measured by the number of students. And this is the subject mix, which is proxied by the share of students in STEM fields. And this is the results of our estimations. We used different ways of identification of our regression discontinuity model. And almost all our estimations show that merger positively and statistically significantly influence efficiency level of university. And here you can see just some illustrations. So we observe these statistically significant gaps in the regression line at this point of discontinuity, at this threshold point. And now I will proceed to some discussion of these results that we have. I think that the main conclusion that we can make here based on the results of our analysis is that merger policy can lead to greater economic efficiency. So relatively larger universities can be ran more efficiently. However, we can identify this effect just near a cutoff point. So if we will, so we can find this positive effect only if we will compare very similar universities. Some of them are merged and some of them are not, and but they are very similar in terms of their performance indicators. And only in this case we can identify this effect. Of course, the results that I have presented about these positive effects of mergers have some limitations, of course. And firstly, as I have mentioned, when I discussed literature review, similar studies for other countries, particularly for the UK and for China, show that this efficiency gain can be observed only in the short run. And in the long run, in the longer period, efficiency turns back to its initial level. And the effect that we have identified in this study can be interpreted only as a short-run effect. And our empirical strategy does not allow us investigating how this efficiency level of merged higher education institutions evolves over time. And another important limitation of our results is that we cannot disentangle the total effect that we observe into different channels. So we cannot say which part of the effect that we estimated is associated with economies of scale, which part is associated with the returns to scope, and which part occurs due to the new managerial practices of higher quality. So the effect that we observe, that we have estimated, is a kind of the total effect that can occur due to all possible channels that we can imagine. And so to conclude, we can say that based on our analysis, we can say that mergers is a good instrument, but it can be used, that can be used for economic optimization of higher education sector. However, it is very important how we organize this merger, meaning that which particular universities are treated, how these universities are selected, how the merger process is organized, and so on. So I think that my time is almost over, so I would stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be glad to answer questions that you maybe have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating, Aleksei. We have a question from Israel. Would you like to ask your question? Would you like to turn on your camera and ask your question? Please go ahead, Israel.
Right, I have a number of questions. Actually, this was a really interesting presentation. Actually, it was really amazing.
Do you want to first? Can I ask you to introduce yourself, where you're from, where you're sitting?
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's do that too. My name is Israel. I am from the Center of Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia in the UK. I work with very similar topics to the ones Aleksei does. So competition, and he does a really interesting article on merger. I work with more competition in general, actually, but especially dedicated to Brazil. And so I have a number of interesting questions that I could ask him, actually. And there's just a few points, just as a start, actually, try to understand better what his paper is doing. Is first, are these universities in the same market? And were there any market power concerns coming from the competition authority there? And the second question would be could this productivity effect that he's observing come from the quality of inputs and not just from the quantity? Is he observing anything in that direction?
Okay, thanks a lot for your questions. I think they are very important. So I will start from the first question regarding the markets where these universities are working. So I would say that these universities represent one market, because as I've mentioned, these universities are rather similar in terms of their quality, in terms of the services that they are providing. So I think these universities are working with the same audience, with the school graduates of approximately the same quality. So in terms of the quality segments of the higher education market in Russia, I would say that all these universities that we have considered in this study represent one market segment. Another, if we consider another dimension, like geographical segments of the market, of course, these universities represent represents different regions. So in most cases, there are no any intersections. So most of these universities were represented, were located in different regions. And if we are talking about these market power concerns and concentration, competition, and so on, of course, this is the issue, and there were a lot of discussions, and there are actually several studies that show that these mergers influence the efficiency of regional higher education systems. So we can observe positive effects on efficiency of particular universities, but we can observe also negative effects on the efficiency of the whole regional higher education system because of the level of the competition. Competition becomes lower because of this merger process. But the Russian context, the important feature of context of Russian higher education system is that our higher education system is very centralized. And we are talking here only about public universities, and almost all these public universities are subordinated by the Federal Ministry of Science and Higher Education. And that's why it was a kind of centralized decision of the ministry, and there were no any concerns that it will be not very good for the competition inside the regional higher education sector and so on. But of course, in the discussions that we have around this merger, we can observe these concerns that you mentioned. And I'm sorry, but could you please remind the second your question?
Is it possible that the improvement in efficiency that you're observing there's another interim question, are there prices, are there fees, or they're free?
We have mixed system. So approximately 50% of students are publicly financed and 50% of students pay tuition.
But there is a fee, yeah?
Yeah.
So could we possibly observe that this improvement in efficiency is actually coming through higher fees, leading to a better quality of inputs? So actually you're observing the quantity of inputs, number of staff, number of inputs, but you're not really observing quality. So there could be an effect coming through there.
Yes, actually, it's an interesting question because, if you're talking about efficiency, we can expect some effects both from the input side and output side. And if we are talking about input side, I would say that there was a kind of optimization because in the input side, we are talking about such indicators as the, for example, number of academic staff, financial resources, and so on. And of course, these merged universities experienced some decline in the total funding that they receive from the government. And they also experienced the decline in the number of faculty because, of course, these mergers lead to the firing of some faculty members. And I would say that probably most of the positive effect on efficiency level is we observe this effect mainly because of the changes in the input side. So maybe the productivity and performance has not increased so much, but we have declined in resources. And taking into account this decline in resources, universities managed to save initial level of performance, and that's why we can observe this efficiency gain. But as I've mentioned, this is a kind of limitation of our methodology because it's a kind of black box. So we can see the effect, but we cannot say for sure why we can observe it. So this kind of limitation.
Great. Thank you very much. Israel, did you want to come back on anything before we go on to the next question?
Yes, actually, so this is a very interesting point actually that he's making. This is really interesting paper actually. I'm very fascinated. And normally what you would observe actually, I've seen it in other papers actually, is that when mergers are within the same markets, that's when you would normally in competition, you would consider them to be mergers and not acquisitions actually, two universities from different markets merging in when they don't belong in the same market. They're very different animals actually in competition. But when you have two to a merger within the same market, you would observe actually a decline in quantity and an increase in price, which is a normal monopolistic type of effect, reduction of competition. But when we see this across market merger that Aleksei is observing, I mean, that is precisely the type of effect that we would expect. Actually, it's very interesting paper actually.
And maybe I would add very briefly about the tuition, because it's important also in the Russian context that universities are not free to set any tuition they are considered to be relevant, because there is this centralized system, and there is a kind of price that university receive from the government for publicly financed student. And actually, university cannot set tuition lower than the sum that they receive from the government. So there are a kind of limitations. So they are not competing by setting different prices, because they are quite limited in terms of which price they can set for their educational services. So yeah, we cannot say this that this is a kind of pure market where we observe competition, price competition. So this centralization of the system create this context where maybe the issues related to the tuitions are not so important. So
great, thank you very much. Can I call on Ellen Hazelcorn, who wants to ask a question? Ellen, and if you can put on your camera, that's great. Thanks.
Hi. Alexei, really interesting. I didn't check to see whether or not you published on that, or we can get a copy of your slides. That would be very interesting. I think my question is partially answered by the end of your previous comment about this being a black box and not actually really understanding what's going on. And I expect that's really what I want to get to, is whether or not what is happening, and are you just looking effectively at measuring the quantum of research outputs and so on, which is not necessarily the figure, or more students, or is there something else going on? Do we have increased quality? Is the efficiency because of changes in the way which the universities are organizing themselves? Are they doing things differently? What's happening in terms of that with regards to effectively their core missions around education and research, and not just the quantum?
Yes, thanks for this question. So we just recently published this paper in Applied Economics. So if you need, I can share the copy of the paper. And as for your question about this black box and what was really happening, I would say that despite when I was answering the question by Israel, I'm told that there was mostly these universities experienced a decline in resources that was available, and maybe this is the case why we observe efficiency gains. But what you are talking about, like how university organize the processes and so on, I think this is also important factor, because the specific feature of this merger policy that we are discussing was that it was not only the decision about merger. These universities that were prescribed for merger also received the kind of expert support from the ministry and from different expert organizations in terms of how to organize this merger efficiently from the management point of view, and how to organize processes in the new merged organization. And in most of these cases that we have considered, the management team was changed after the merger. And taking all this into account, of course, we can expect some pretty significant changes in managerial practices that are adopted in these new organizations. And also we can expect that these are managerial practices of higher quality that allowed these universities to achieve greater performance with the same amount of resources, or even declined amount of resources, and as a result improve their efficiency level. So I think, of course, I can repeat it one more time, that we do not know for sure because our empirical strategy does not allow us to know it for sure. But if we're talking about hypothesis of what could change in this organization, I would say that the changes in management is also a very important thing.
It'd be interesting to pursue this by doing some case studies.
Yeah,
Trying to get below the surface as to what exactly has been going on and why, and what the changes and implications and so on are for that, given the fact that this is a huge issue. I mean, you use certain indicators by which you identified a group that was weak and hence going into, were those the official, or was this used for your research? Was that the official way in which the government did pursue this policy, or was that just used by yourself for the research?
Yeah, I think it's very good suggestion, and I think we have already discussed so that we can go inside this black box by using some qualitative methodologies rather than quantitative, maybe to make some kind of interviews with the managers that were involved in this merger process, maybe do some case studies. I think it's a kind of the next step of our analysis. So thank you for this suggestion.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. Can I just ask another question before we move on to Rubin? Given at the outset, you showed the way in which, or you suggested that those that were selected for merger, there were some that weren't performing that well, but they were not selected for merger, if I understood correctly at the outset of your talk. So what role did local and central, and you said you have a highly centralized system, what role did both local and central politics play in terms of identifying exactly which universities should be merged and which universities shouldn't be? And also, we haven't talked about who they merge with. Are they merging with very local other, institutions that are very local, or I don't know. I mean, distances are huge in Russia, so how did it actually work in practice?
Yeah, it's very interesting question. Thank you for it. And I would start by saying that due to the fact that Russian higher education sector is very centralized one, and almost all universities are subordinated to the Federal Ministry of Education or other federal agencies, local governments have very limited opportunities to participate somehow in any decisions related to the universities located on the territories of these regions. Very limited. Of course, some regions which have enough resources, they have their own institutions that are subordinated not to the federal government, but by the regional government, and then region can play some important role in a regional higher education market. But in general, both if we are talking about decision about mergers, or if we are talking about some other decisions, the role is very limited. But of course, there could be some informal communications between heads of the regions and some representatives of the federal authorities. And if we would talk about some previous waves of the mergers, for example, that was happening during the 1990s, just after the collapse of Soviet Union, I would say that there would be some role of heads of the regions or regional governments in these processes and decisions that were made. But of course, it's a kind of hypothesis. It's very difficult to study somehow which particular role regional government played in this process. But actually, the reason why we have selected this type of merger based on the monitoring of performance for our analysis is that we can assume that in this particular case, the design of the merger policy was formalized. So the role of this kind of informal communications between different stakeholders was not so high, because we have a clear criteria. We have these performance indicators. If you have achieved thresholds, okay, you can continue your operations. If you failed to achieve these thresholds, you are prescribed for merger. And actually, this is why this wave of merger seems to be the most appropriate one for some kind of quantitative analysis of what was going on. And when I was talking about a kind of control group of comparable universities that are comparable in terms of performance but did not receive this inefficient status, I mean that so we have a kind of threshold. So those who are just below, they are not prescribed for the treatment, and those who are just above, so vice versa, they are not prescribed to the treatment, to the merger. And we are, but still, these are very similar organizations. And actually, we utilize this specific feature of the policy for our methodology. Only this fact about the policy design allowed us to implement this quasi-experimental estimation. And actually, you know, in this particular case, we cannot say that there was some significant role of the local government. So these are purely the decisions of the Central Federal Ministry of Education.
And what about the other element is what these institutions were with which institutions they merged with, and was that dictated centrally as well?
Yes, of course. In most cases, these were institutions located in the same city, not in the same region, because, you know, even inside one region, we could have huge distances. That's why the merger was possible only with organization that was located in the same city. Of course, there were a couple of cases, I would say, when this inefficient status received universities that were the only universities in their cities, and there were no other organizations with whom they could be merged together. And in this case, in this couple of cases, there was just license withdrawal from this university. So these universities were that didn't have any opportunity to merge with other organizations in the same city, they just stopped their activities. But yeah, mostly it was universities located in the same city, but this group of universities to whom they were merged, this actually rather a heterogeneous group of universities. So it could be rather large universities, or it could be quite comparable institutions. So there is a heterogeneity here.
Right, and the fact that it's an urban population, does that therefore affect some of those indicators too?
Sorry, say it again.
The fact that it's that by definition they're mergers within an urban context.
Yes.
So what impact does that have?
Yes, this is the merger in the urban context. So the only possibility of merger was only when the campuses of merging institutions are located in the same area. So in order to make it possible for students to go to different campuses and to use the whole infrastructure of both institutions that are merged.
Okay, great, thank you. Ruben, would you like to ask your question? I don't know, Ruben, are you still with us? Yeah, Ruben Nigeo.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, would you like to turn on your camera and introduce yourself?
I have a problem with my camera a bit,
Okay.
But you can hear me?
Yes, so would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Alexia in a public university in Kenya. Kenya in Africa. And there have been a discussion about mergers of public universities. But different stakeholders have had different opinions, some supporting it, some don't support it. So it has not worked yet. So what is your opinion regarding that? What can be done maybe for mergers to be implemented in Kenyan universities?
I think
public universities, yeah.
Yeah, I think
you.
it's, yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's quite an important issue because, of course, when we are talking about merger, we have a lot of different groups of stakeholders. And what we did in our study, we have estimated the effects of merger for one particular indicator, which is the economic efficiency. And probably this is a kind of indicator that is interesting, for example, for Federal Ministry of Education or for management of particular university and so on. But of course, there are a lot of other different groups of stakeholders. First of all, these are students, these are faculty members and so on. And actually, I think that last week, my colleague Ksenia Romanenko discussed the consequences of merger process that are experienced by students. And of course, if we would compare the opinion of different stakeholders that are involved somehow in this merger process, of course, we can observe rather opposite opinions. And this is actually a case for Russia, because in some cases of merger, we observed quite active public reaction, a kind of student protests against these mergers and so on. So I think if we are talking, when we are talking about the effects of merger policies, we should also define which is our target population, which is our group of stakeholders for which we can estimate this effect.
Thank you. Great. And the final question, Christina, over to you. And would you like to
Hello.
introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, Craig. Hello, everybody. My name is Cristina Carvalho from Brazil, University of Brasilia. Thanks so much for our presentation. It's wonderful. And I worked with mergers in higher education in Brazil for private sector, especially. So I'm very curious about Russia case. So in the public higher education staff composed by civil servants, or in the case of merger, academic and administrative staffs have lost their jobs? Because in Brazil, there are stability for public sector and general civil servants as well. I don't know what happened in Russia, so I'm very curious about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for a question. Unfortunately, maybe we do not have this kind of stability that you have, because formally faculty members and administrative staff at the universities are not civil servants.
Okay.
And for example, most faculty members in Russia have rather short-time contracts. So it could be a contract for 1 year, for 2 years, for 3 years, and so on. So it was not a kind of great problem for their organizers of this policy to fire some part of the faculty members or some part of the administrative staff. And in most cases, they did this optimization, especially in terms of faculty members. So yeah, this is not actually a case for Russian context.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Answer.
Great. Well, I think we're sort of on the hour, damn nearly. I don't think we've got time for another question. So I just, Aleksei, is there anything else you'd like to add to sum up?
Just to sum up, I think it was a rather productive discussion. There were very interesting questions, and of course, we are discussing how to develop this line of our research related to the university mergers. And I think there were a lot of interesting points for our internal discussions about how can we, where can we move these studies further. So thanks all participants. It was really useful and productive.
Well, and thank you very much indeed. And just to let everybody know that Aleksei's seminar will be available tomorrow morning on the CG website. and that next week our webinar will be on, the next CG webinar will be on Thursday, and that's about international student education in China, an island in internationalization. And you can register either on the chat, in the chat function, or alternatively, you can go to the CG website. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks for attending a fascinating seminar, really, really interesting. And take care, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.